"She's just a nobody." That's what my mother said, loud enough for the silverware to tremble against the polished wood. Then she laughed like my existence was some private family joke she'd been rehearsing for years. My brother didn't flinch. My father looked down at his plate. But Megan, my brother's fiancée, froze mid-scroll, her phone hovering just below the table as she typed my name into Google. I watched her eyes widen. I watched the color drain from my mother's face. In less than 30 seconds, everything in that dining room shifted, and none of them were ready for what she found. My name is Julia Monroe, and if you had stepped into my parents' house that night, you might have thought you were walking into a high-gloss magazine spread. Warm lights, dark oak trim, a table dressed like a quiet brag about a perfect suburban life in Fort Collins, Colorado. But perfection in that house was always a performance, and I was never part of the cast. I grew up between those walls knowing exactly where I stood. My mother, Karen, curated our family's image the way some people tend gardens, relentlessly, trimming away anything that didn't look the way she wanted to. My father, David, stayed quiet out of habit, not out of cruelty. And my brother Ryan, well, he was the son everything orbited. His trophies lined the hallway, his school photos covered every wall, his name floated through every conversation like a song they never got tired of hearing. The golden child, the pride, the one who made them look good. Not one photo of me hung in that hallway, not one. The first time I noticed, I was 14. The last time I noticed was the night everything changed. I learned invisibility long before I learned independence. I still remember being 8 years old, holding a short story I'd written. My teacher had circled the title with a bright red A+ and scribbled "Exceptional Imagination" in the corner. I placed it right in front of my mother while she tied Ryan's cleats for his big game. She barely looked at it. "That's nice, honey. Put it on the counter. We'll look at it later." Later never came. 3 days later, I found my story under a pile of mail with a coffee ring stamped across the page. No one had read a word. By high school, I stopped offering pieces of myself. Every writing competition I won, every article I published in the local teen magazine, every small accolade, they all slipped quietly into the drawers of my bedroom. Because every time I tried to share my accomplishments, I got the same response. "Writing is a hobby, Julia. You need something more practical." Meanwhile, Ryan won an award for a business class project, and my mother invited the neighbors over to celebrate. So, I did what quiet kids with loud inner worlds eventually do. I left. Denver became my breath of air. A tiny apartment, a borrowed desk, midnight writing sessions after long shifts, stacks of drafts forming fragile towers beside my bed. It wasn't glamorous, but it was mine. And for the first time, people saw my work. Professors encouraged me, editors pushed me, and my mentor, Annabelle Reyes, still the sharpest mind I've ever met, looked over my pages and said, "There's a voice here, a real one." I built a career brick by brick, publication by publication, book by book. The irony was, my work traveled farther than I ever did. My name ended up in places my family never bothered to look. I never hid my success. I just stopped volunteering it. There's only so many times a person can be dismissed before they stop offering softness. Which brings me back to that dinner. The polished table, the curated smiles, the way my mother laughed at me that night, sharp enough to cut. Ryan discussing honeymoon plans like nothing else in the world mattered. My father avoiding eye contact as though silence could soften the blow. And Megan, new to the family but sharper than the rest of them, watching the exchange with the confusion that slowly shifted into suspicion. She didn't understand why they talked to me that way, why my mother's laughter felt so rehearsed, why I seemed to shrink a little every time someone mentioned Ryan. Then she picked up her phone, and the life I had built far from that house, the one they had never once asked about, glowed right there on her screen. Megan didn't look away from her phone at first. Her thumb hovered, scrolling slowly, like she wasn't sure she was allowed to believe what she was reading. The light from her screen crossed her face, revealing confusion, then curiosity, then disbelief. Meanwhile, my mother kept talking, unaware the veneer she depended on was beginning to crack. "So, the venue says they can move us up the list," Karen said, slicing her steak with stiff precision. "Once they realize it's Ryan's wedding, they'll make it happen." Megan hummed politely, still staring at her phone. Ryan didn't notice. He was too busy describing the custom suit he'd ordered for the big day. My father nodded along, orbiting my mother's opinions the way he always had. I took a sip of water to ground myself. The room felt too warm, as if the walls themselves remembered every slight I swallowed growing up. My mother's laughter rang out again, sharp, metallic. "You know, Megan," she said, lowering her voice, like she was sharing a secret meant to shame me gently. "Julia has always been sensitive. She takes things too seriously. She just needs to lighten up." There it was, the dismissal she wore like perfume. The tone sheet used my entire life, the one that took every feeling I'd ever had and flattened it into something inconvenient. My jaw tightened, not in anger, but in recognition. But Megan didn't smile. She didn't nod. She didn't pretend to agree. She whispered, almost to herself, "That's odd." My mother caught it immediately. "What's odd?" Megan finally looked at me, not with pity, not with confusion, but with the curiosity of someone who has just found a locked door in a house they thought they already understood. "Nothing," she said softly. "I was just looking something up." The table stilled, barely noticeable unless you'd spent your whole life sensing tension before it hit. Ryan paused mid-sentence. My father shifted in his chair. My mother narrowed her eyes. "What are you looking up?" she asked too casually. Megan hesitated, just a blink, but enough to show she was piecing things together. The dynamics, the silences, the way no one had asked me a single thing all night. Something didn't add up. Before she could answer, Ryan cut in. "Probably something about the wedding. Don't stress her out, Mom." Karen forced a smile, but kept her eyes locked on Megan. "Well, I hope it's something useful. There's a lot to finalize." I pushed a carrot around my plate. The air thickened, heavy like a storm cloud forming over the centerpiece. The worst part was I knew exactly what Megan was seeing on her screen. The articles, the interviews, the panels, readings, videos. My name printed in crisp fonts my mother had never bothered to search. For the first time that night, I didn't feel invisible. I felt exposed. But not in a bad way. Exposed the way a fuse feels when it's finally lit. Megan looked at me again. Longer, this time, her expression shifting with a slow dawning understanding. Then she set her phone down, folded her hands, and breathed in softly, deliberately, like she was choosing the exact moment to break open the evening. It was the breath before impact. Megan scrolled. There were interviews, reviews, panels, readings, videos. My name everywhere. Public, easy to find. Anyone could have seen it with one search. The simplicity of that is what finally cracked something in me. Not the shock, not the recognition, but the fact that anyone could have known and they had not. My mother's face went rigid. "This must be a mistake," she said, fumbling for control like someone who had practiced composure so often it was part of her bones. "Maybe you submitted something once and they exaggerated," she added, as if belittling my career could make it smaller, easier to swallow. I let out a quiet breath. "It's not a mistake." The syllables landed like a final note. She flinched at my tone. Not loud, not angry, just certain. "You could have told us," she snapped, grasping for the narrative she'd owned for years. "You could have made sure we understood." My fingers curled in my lap. "Mom," I said, keeping my voice steady even though the tightness in my throat felt like a physical thing. "I tried. I kept trying." She opened her mouth, but Megan stepped in, gentle and firm. "Karen, you had so many chances." Ryan looked at me like a man finally seeing the ghost he'd been walking beside his whole life without knowing. David took off his glasses and rubbed his lenses with trembling fingers, the way people do when a thought is too heavy to carry. He asked, voice small, "Those awards, those articles, are they a big deal?" "They are," Megan said before I could say. "Huge." For a moment, the room held its breath. Something like regret passed over my father's face, and my mother's posture hardened as if she were bracing for a blow she imagined coming from everywhere but herself. She pointed at the device as though the device were an intruder. "So what? You wrote a few things and people liked them. That doesn't mean—" Her sentence stopped as if the end of it had been pulled away. My laugh cut her off. Not bitter, not theatrical, just tired and real. "Mom," I said, quietly, "I didn't need you to understand the publishing world. I just needed you to see me." Silence pressed in so heavily that the air itself seemed tight. I looked at Ryan. "Do you remember the year I won the statewide writing competition?"
He blinked, unsure, the memory slipping from him like a faded photograph. Maybe, I mean, I had a game that day, right? You had a playoff. You had a playoff, I corrected softly. Mom and Dad chose the game over my award. My mother's jaw tightened. Her eyes flickered with the strain of someone trying to look away from a mirror that suddenly showed them differently. I brought home the trophy, I continued. I put it on the kitchen counter. You moved it the next day because it cluttered the space. It ended up in a box in the basement. That sentence landed harder than I had expected. My father's shoulders slumped like someone who had been holding the wrong weight for years. I swallowed and pushed on. When my first book came out, I mailed copies to you, signed. My mother's face shifted, something like defensiveness, then something like surprise that she had been excluded from a truth she thought she had curated. That's not fair, she snapped. We were busy. So was I said, and the smallness in my voice surprised me. But I still sent them. A long, fragile pause stretched between us like a held breath. Then Megan, who has the uncanny habit of asking the thing no one else dares, said, Karen, did you ever, just once, Google Julia Monroe? My mother stiffened as if the word itself was an accusation. I don't make a habit of snooping, she said, voice brittle. It's not snooping, Megan replied. Gentle, but cutting. It's caring. My father closed his eyes, not in anger, but in the slow dawn of realization.
We really didn't know, he whispered, but maybe we should have. Ryan shook his head, stunned. Liv, I swear I didn't mean to, he said, and I heard the sincerity in him. He'd been living in the orbit of my mother's spotlight for so long he hadn't learned to look around. I know, I interrupted, because it wasn't his fault. It was the pattern they'd been folded into. Everything had always orbited Karen. Ryan thrived in the sunlight she gave him. I had lived in the shadows she insisted were my rightful place. My mother's composure finally showed a crack. So what now? She demanded, as if solutions were policies and apologies currency. You want an apology? You want us to grovel? I stared at her, at the woman who'd spent decades pointing at perfection and expecting the world to take her word. No, I said, voice steady. I just want honesty for once. My father whispered, we failed you, and in that tiny phrase there was a lifetime of too late reckonings. My mother looked like she wanted to argue, to reclaim the narrative, but she couldn't. Not with the glow of the phone on the table, not with the quiet conviction in my voice, not with the evidence she had refused to seek now pinned under the light between us. Megan placed her phone face down, an act that felt like a benediction more than a gesture. I think Julia deserves better than the way she's been treated, she said. Maybe tonight is a chance to start. Ryan swallowed and nodded, the first stitch of repair forming in his throat. Yeah, he managed. My father said, if you're willing, voice thin with hope and fear. My mother didn't speak. For the first time I could remember, she had nothing to say. I pushed my chair back, my legs steady in a way that surprised me. I stood up and said, I'm not asking for perfection. I just want recognition, a little space at the table you've kept me outside of for years. I didn't know if they could give it, but I knew one thing with absolute clarity. If they didn't, I'd still be okay. I'd built a life in the daylight where I wasn't invisible, and that life didn't depend on their acknowledgement. I left the dining room that night without slamming doors or demanding promises. I gathered my coat, nodded politely, and walked out into the cold Colorado air. The chill felt clean, like oxygen after years of breathing smoke. The next morning, I drove back to Denver. The highway rolled out steady and quiet beneath me, giving me the physical space I'd suddenly understood I needed. My Brooklyn apartment seemed different when I unlocked the door, as if it had been waiting for me to return fully to myself without being split into daughter and writer. 3 weeks passed before my father's call came. It wasn't small talk. It wasn't excuses. He asked, haltingly, "What's the title of your first book?" His voice shook when he said he wanted to start from the beginning, as if reading me from the first page might stitch a bridge between the house I grew from and the life I'd carved out. A month later, a package arrived from Colorado, copies of my books, each one dog-eared with sticky tabs, evidence of reading that was tentative and earnest. Inside the first cover was a note in his neat handwriting, "I'm listening now. Thank you for not giving up on your voice." My throat tightened at those words in a way awards never had.
Ryan called after that, asking about my next project. Genuinely curious, asking questions that were specific and weirdly intimate. What inspired a character? How did a chapter start? What did it feel like when the book was accepted? Megan checked in more than anyone. Her messages were warm, not guilty, filled with plans to introduce me properly at family gatherings and to make sure her future children knew Julia Monroe, the author, not Julia, the afterthought. Even my mother shifted, slowly and awkwardly. She joined a book club and recommended my novel with hesitant pride. When she spoke to me, there was a new carefulness, as if she'd learned at last that words could wound and could also mend. Our family didn't transform overnight. There were stumbles, old jokes resurfaced, and silences that used to be comfortable still felt like traps sometimes. But the fog that had sat over us began to lift, thinned by small acts of attention and by the truth finally told. 3 months after that dinner, I was in my living room holding my father's letter and felt a surprising clarity settle over me. Being overlooked had never defined me. I had already built a life that was visible, worthy, and complete. Their recognition arrived late, and afterward, not the foundation. That realization was the thing I hadn't known I was waiting for. Maybe that's what healing looks like, letting truth speak louder than the roles we'd been cast in. If you've ever fought to be seen, tell me your story in the comments. And if this one stayed with you, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next chapter. You never know whose truth might echo yours.